This is Laoghaire Avenue, Sandycove, a typical middle-class road full of 19th century houses, often lived in by elderly or retired people. Earlier this year, an act was passed called the Landlord and Tenant Act. The Minister for Justice said of it, "For the first time in Irish law, we now have the principle of leasehold enfranchisement. Very simply, this means that persons who own their houses subject to a ground rent are given the right to acquire the fee simple." And the press commented on the act that any house owner in the state will be entitled to buy out the freehold of his property by offering the landlord a sum equaling 13.2 times his annual ground rent. However, it wasn't quite as simple as that, and that's why I'm here. The law on this subject is so extremely complicated that the tenant has in fact to examine his title and see what kind of lease he has, a building lease, an occupancy lease, a broken lease, or whatever. Very complicated. I don't really understand it myself. Now, usually, for example, with a new house, this is simple enough on the surface, but there are cases where it isn't simple. One of these cases is on the Proby Estate, which is owned by Mr Peter Proby. Mr Proby's estate covers a large area in Sandycove, Laoghaire, Stillorgan and Blackrock. The position, as far as we can find it out, is something like this. In the 19th century, leases were granted to builders whose successors would now normally have building leases. But these original leases expired around 1905. They were then renewed. It's so long ago that it's rather hard to prove the precise status of these renewed leases, but apparently they were not building leases. These 1905 period leases are now in turn expiring. What is the position of the people who live in the houses concerned? Mr Patrick Boland is the owner of number 5 Laoghaire Avenue. Mr Boland, this house number 5 Laoghaire Avenue, this is your home, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
Would you tell me when you bought it?
In 1956.
And how much did you pay for it then?
£1,550 to the First National Building Society.
At that period, how long had your lease got to run?
9 years.
And your ground rent?
It was £15 a year.
Well, knowing you had only 9 years lease to run, why did you buy it?
Well, on the papers at that time, we believed that we had the right to buy out. We would have the right to buy out our ground rents, and I believed that I would get a renewal of lease, at least, at reasonable terms.
Well, what in fact happened when your lease expired?
When my lease expired, Mr Proby, the landlord, he brought along a valuer who valued the house for £5,000, and because I had not got a building lease because of a flaw in the 1958 and 67 Act, I was not entitled to buy out under the 67 Act. But he offered me a 21-year lease at £240 a year, or rebuy the house at £5,000.
And what did you do?
I did not accept this. Then, on Good Friday evening in 1966, he served an ejectment notice on me. This was the weekend which this country celebrated its independence. I was served an ejectment notice by the bursar of Eton College in England. I fought this in court on myself on 6 occasions. But the flaw in the act defeated me, and I had to purchase the freehold for £3,000, which was 200 times my ground rent.
Miss A. Torrance lives with her sister in number 3 Laoghaire Avenue. Miss Torrance, how long have you and your sister lived in this house?
Since my mother bought it in 1921.
And what ground rent have you paid during that period?
£16 a year.
Well, now, you pay this to the Proby Estate too?
The Proby Estate, yes.
When did your lease expire?
March 65.
And what terms were you offered for renewal?
A 21-year lease at £240 per annum, tenant responsible for all outgoings. But as long as either my sister or myself were actually living in the house, he would take £32. And later on, this was reduced to 29. But of course, the 240 was still in the background.
Well, did you accept this?
No, we did not.
Why?
Well,
it would
have been taken from us. I mean, it really was confiscation.
Miss Breen, you live in Burdett Avenue, but you also pay your ground rent to the Proby Estate.
Yes.
Well, what ground rent did you pay?
It originally was £17, But now he has made it £100.
And at what length of lease?
For 21 years only.
And you have signed up to do this?
Yes.
Well, why did you agree to pay this big increase in ground rent?
Well, because I was afraid the landlord might confiscate it.
Mr. Vincent Pentony, a teacher of music in the Royal Irish Academy and organist in Weston Road Church, is the occupier of number 4 Ballygarden Avenue. How long have you lived in your house?
21 years.
And when did your lease expire?
On the 25th of March, 1965.
And what terms did Mr. Proby offer you for renewal?
Well, in 1964, when I served notice of my intention to renew the lease, I got no reply until August of 1965, in which he sent me a letter, and the terms of the lease were that I was to have a new lease at £240 a year for 21 years.
And have you agreed to this?
No.
Well, have you agreed to anything?
No. In the sense that there was a case in court, and there was a question there of buying out the ground rent for £1,800, which works out at about 112 years purchase.
Well, if you did that, how long have you got to find that £1,800?
Until the end of 1968.
Mr. Proby, you are agent for your brother's estate in Ireland. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's quite correct.
Now, there's been quite an amount of unfavourable publicity about the position of these tenants in Sandycove. I wonder if you care to comment.
Yes, I am, of course, very much concerned about these rumours. Certain very inaccurate rumours have been circulated. For instance, it was reported at one stage that there were 150 leases which were in jeopardy. In fact, there are only 5 cases in Sandycove where leases have expired and where we have so far been unable to come to terms with the tenants. Nothing unpleasant is contemplated in respect of these 5 leases, and we are awaiting an announcement by the Minister. What we are endeavouring to do in the case of all long-standing tenants of the estate who may have bought houses thinking they had rights of renewal is to give them tenancies for life at low rents.
Well, and you mentioned a good point there, thinking they had rights of renewal. I think a lot of the trouble here hangs on the difference between a building lease and an occupational lease. This is a difference which it is difficult for the layman to understand. I wonder, could you say a few words on that?
Yes, well, this is a very important point. In point of fact, nowadays, about 97 or 98% of all leases are building leases, but there are a few leases which are occupational leases. Well, now, the essential difference between building lease and an occupational lease is that with a building lease, the landlord owns the ground, but the tenant owns the bricks and mortar. In an occupational lease, on the other hand, the landlord owns the ground and the bricks and mortar. Well, now, it may, to some people, seem desirable that all leases should be exactly the same and that this distinction should be done away with. But I personally believe it would be most damaging if this happened, because it would mean that people could never let a house. Furthermore, it is quite essential at the present time that new building should take place, and we see insurance companies and development companies putting up blocks of buildings and spending a lot of money on building, and all this would cease if there were no occupational leases. The thing that is unfortunate is that at the present time, somebody who buys a house, unless they are a trained lawyer, has no means of knowing whether the lease is a building lease or an occupational lease, as it is a matter of historical fact, and is sometimes not at all clear. And this, I think, is very unfortunate. I have the very greatest sympathy for anybody in Sandycove who bought a lease many years ago thought they had rights of renewal and now finds that they haven't.
How many of you will find yourself in the predicament of these people in Sandycove? Mr. Claude Proby says that only some 3 to 5% of his tenants are affected, but 5% of an estate of this size is a fair amount of houses. If the 1967 Act really set out, as it was claimed to do, to enable any householder in the state to buy out the freehold of his property, whether the ground landlord liked it or not, why should these people here find that unless they pay what the landlord asks, they face eviction, like Mr. Boland, or the realization, like Mr. Pentony or the Torrance sisters, that what they thought of as their own homes are in fact buildings in which the landlord may permit them to remain until they die, but which they cannot freely sell or bequeath. One newspaper described the 67 Act as completing the cycle of freedom of which Fintan Lawlor spoke. Can we in equity say that the draftsmen have finished their job while these people are left out? And finally, who knows if there are not other estates, the large estates which are historically the landlords of most in Dublin, in which similar situations may not possibly occur. In short, if you own a house, or perhaps I should say, if you think you own a house, I take a good look at your lease.